So now we could begin to talk about the most critical period of crisis in U.S. history here in this course, and that's the Civil War and the buildup to the Civil War. Historians often note three periods of crisis, right, that really stand out. Of course, that's the American Revolution, which we already discussed, but also the Civil War and in the 1900s, the Great Depression. So certainly the Civil War demands a lot of our attention. And as we'll realize, the buildup to the Civil War was something that involved not just slavery, though, of course, slavery is the central aspect, the central factor in terms of causation, but it also involves a lot of other factors that we will piece together in this discussion. Now, as we now know, the U.S. turned its attention away from England and even from Europe as a whole, especially after the War of 1812, as we discussed. You know, it's focused more on its domestic development, economic development, the building of nationalism. And we also know about the democratic revolutions of the Jacksonian period, where you have universal male suffrage, and not to mention economically the market revolution, which we just discussed. Uh, Yet the political landscape that's going to characterize the nation between the 1840s, even though, the origins of this start way back, in the 1700s, but nonetheless, for our purposes, we could begin to discuss the buildup of the Civil War or leading to the Civil War from the 1840s through the 1860s. And by the way, the images that you see here before you on this slide, here is Harriet Tubman, who's been talked about lately as a possible replacement for Andrew Jackson of the $20 bill, right? She's a famous abolitionist and who helped slaves escape. This is the famous event, perhaps infamous event, of the caning of the Senator Charles Sumner. And Charles Sumner was a well known abolitionist, which we'll discuss again. Abolitionism is basically the social movement that wanted to eliminate the institution of slavery in our country. And it's morally guided rather than, politically. But nonetheless, here is a political figure, Charles Sumner, who actually gets beaten up. He gets caned pretty badly by someone who opposed his abolitionist views and Sumner's condemnation of the South and its Southern slavery, right? So he gets beat up by someone, and one example of the violence, if anything, that serves as a foreshadowing of the violence to come with the Civil War that erupts by 1861. And then here you see something associated with what's called the Fugitive Slave Act, and we'll discuss this. But basically, you see as a compromise between the North and South before the Civil War. A compromise was struck whereby the North agreed to breathe new life into what's called the Fugitive Slave Law, which means that, for any escaped slaves going away from the South towards the North, that if any American citizen had any knowledge of them, that they are legally obliged to notify the authorities. This is called the Fugitive Slave Act that, again, becomes revivified during this time period. And needless to say, it's met with much controversy by some Northerners. Okay, so as I mentioned, what happens here is between the 1840s and 1860s is this growing political state of affairs that we could call sectionalism. Okay. And first of all, let's define what sectionalism is. Basically, when we use the term sectionalism, it refers to political divisions that have been influenced or have been determined by geography, okay, rather than other factors such as, political parties that oppose each other or maybe competing ideologies. Here you see geography as the primary causal factor in affecting political antagonism. Okay. Now, there's, of course, even though it involves geography, of course, there's an economic dimension to sectionalism, right? It should be obvious to us that in the North, you have one political economy, and that's in sharp contrast to the South. We know that the North is a quote free society. That is to say that it prohibits slavery, right? And it's beginning its industrial revolution, let's say before the Civil War, right, in the 1850s. So therefore, you don't see slaves as the primary source of labor. Rather, you see by this time, if not farmers, then you begin to see factory workers, right? Now in the South, it's obviously agrarian based, not industrial. It's not commercial. That's not to say it's separated from the market because, as we'll discuss, actually, their agrarian products are being sold on the market in the global level. But nonetheless, it is agrarian based, and as we know, the primary source of labor is not quote free labor, meaning employees, or let's call them factory workers, right? The working class. Rather, they are slaves. Now, because of these divergent political economies, what you see here is a clash. Now, you could sort of explain this in a structural sense, meaning we could depsychologize this event of the eventuation of the Civil War between the North and the South by thinking of it this way, that both political economies are inherently expansionist. They're going to expand. Why? Because they're driven by the goal of profit. And if you want to expand, that entails geographic expansion, right? Just like you see, businesses expand from one city to the next and then from one state to the next. And before you know it, they're global, right? Because they're so successful. So too do you see back then, Southern cotton, to be specific, becoming expansionist because of all the profit being made. So they expand geographically, but so does northern economic output, right? And northern profit entail expansionism. So in a way, if they are situated within this finite area called the United States, they're going to collide with each other because they're both expansionist, right? It's bound to happen. So in an economic way, that's kind of restrictive. Let's be honest, or let's just say it's not exactly the best way to explain it, but it's still valuable, right? In its value as an explanatory framework. To see this as the structural event of two colliding political economies. All right, so um, that's the structural explanation of sectionalism, and that map before you here kind of lays out, right? Um, the North, again, this is division by geography, right? Geopolitical. It's sectionalism. So here's the North, and they're blue, and then here's the South, and they're colored gray. All this area to the west we will talk about, but it's not yet established whether they're free or whether they're slave states. And then, of course, these two states, however, did become free states on the eve of the Civil War. Okay, so this is what it looked like. If you were able to look at a political map, right, during the 1850s and certainly by 1860s on the eve of the Civil War. So questions arise here. How and why did this sectionalism emerge? What were the causes of sectionalism and therefore causes of the Civil War? Because as we know, well, perhaps we don't all know if you were educated abroad and never gained an education in U.S. history, you might not know this, but the Civil Wars were between the North and the South, between northern states and southern states. So obviously that is pointedly geographical, excuse me. Okay, so this issue of causation looms large, and I just mentioned this a while back, right? That sure it was uh, revolving around the issue of slavery, the outbreak of the Civil War, right? At the same time, that is perhaps too reductive, meaning that you can't reduce this very complicated, very complex event called the Civil War. You can't really reduce it down to one factor. That's almost a fallacy in thinking, historical thinking. It's too reductive. All right. So, again, we're going to discuss the various causes of the Civil War that involve other factors. And what will happen is they will all coalesce together into this constellation of causal factors that I argue goes a far way in explaining the outbreak of the Civil War. But let's return again to sectionalism, right? What causes sectionalism? Um, Now, in order to understand this, we already recognize that the North is based on commercialism, and what you could call, quote, free labor. And let me remind you that free labor basically means you're not a slave, right? You work as an employee. You enter an employment situation by signing a contract, right? And when you sign a contract, no one's putting a gun to your head. You're not coerced. You enter it on your own free will, and therefore, it's called free labor. We don't use that term today, but back then it was used. And that's opposed to unfree labor or slave labor, which is again characterizing the southern states here. And what we need to understand is this layout here was not the case um, in the preceding decades. All right. So we need to understand what leads to this map, the buildup of events leading to this map by 1860. Now, we just talked about the South being, enmeshed in this system that involved African American slavery. And this is peculiar, right? And when we use the word peculiar here, we're not talking about, how it's used today, kind of like, weird or strange, right? It's more relating to something that's unique. So historians have called this in the past slavery as, quote, the peculiar institution of the South, meaning that it's unique to the South and it's not present in the North. What's going to happen, as we talked about in the northern states, they will abandon and abolish slavery legally, and these events, the abolition of slavery, will make these regional differences even more stark. Okay, let me return back to this map here. And, it's interesting to note here that there is this sort of de facto line that was drawn up to separate the North and South. That's known as the Mason-Dixon line, right? It was basically drawn by two surveyors. They were trying to settle this boundary dispute between here you had Maryland, right, and Pennsylvania, and they were trying to settle this dispute. Oh, what's Maryland and what's Pennsylvania? And informally, these surveyors, Mason and Dixon, drew out this line that separated two. And it just happens that south of the line is comprised of slave states, and north of the line is comprised of free states. All right, so that sort of becomes the line that separates the two. Now, let's recall that the anti-slavery impulse was actually fed by the American Revolution. Okay, most founders at the time actually hoped that slavery would die out. It would die a, quote, natural death, if you recall that discussion, right? But as we now know, that would not happen, though they hoped it would happen in the early 1800s, right? It's not what happened because the South, again, began to profit greatly from slave labor. In fact, it never died. It actually grew exponentially. Now, I did mention this in our discussion of the Constitution, that there was this agreement made, a compromise struck between the attendees there in the convention, and the South agreed. Well, let's just say that the issue of slavery could not be resolved, so they decided as a compromise to abolish the slave trade 20 years into the future, and hence by 1808, that's exactly what happened. Okay, so you had less than a million slaves in 1800. But on the eve of the Civil War in 1861, the slave population was 4 million. Obviously, this is not due to the slave trade. This is due to natural increase, right? And we know why, because of hereditary slavery, right? Partus sequitur ventrum. All right, so the increase happens. It's 600% increase in slave population in only 7 decades. That's enormous. And I mentioned that in some states like South Carolina and Mississippi, the blacks were the majority there. They were not the minority, right? Now, ever since England abolished its slave trade, the United States took over as the center of the New World slavery. Okay. And it's important to note here that the Old South, to use that term that they did, right? The Old South refers to the antebellum South. That's another phrase you might have heard of. It basically means before the war, the Civil War between 1861 and 1865. So the Old South was the largest and most powerful slave society that the modern world, okay, not the world of antiquity, but the modern world had ever known. All right. Now, this large number of slaves uh, led to the white majority in these states fostering their dedication to protecting slavery, and therefore to promote as much as they can white supremacy, because white supremacy was central. That idea was central in keeping African Americans from rebelling. Okay, they had to inculcate among their slaves this notion that slaves were inferior, right? So, that's part of the racial ideology in the South. This idea of inherent inferiority of African Americans, even their subhumanization, referring to them or conceiving of them as primitive, one step removed from being animals, right? So, we will continue in the following slide.